Hello everyone, and welcome back to yet another Trackmania seasonal video. This time around, we have the Fall 24 season. Just like in previous seasons' videos, I'll be going over each and every track throughout the campaign, giving my opinions on them and giving my ratings for them. However, unlike the past few seasons, I will not be giving my rankings on the track comparing them to seasons past, because simply put, I was not very happy with how my rankings are in their current state, because I made those rankings when I only had about a year of experience in the game, so add an additional year on top of that to where I am now, and just being much better at the game. My opinions on a lot of the tracks have changed greatly, and I would like to re-rank everything, so that is not ready for this season, but hopefully it will be ready for next season. So with that said, let's get it started here with track number 1. Now, track number 1 is pretty close to a full-speed grass track. Not quite there, but you know what? It's close enough. But I do want to give him credit for two things on this track. First of all, the length. I have been asking for longer white tracks in general because the longer a track is, the more substance it has. And this one is definitely much longer than average here. And I also want to give him credit for the amount of, skill required to get a good time on this track. Typically, track number 1s have a pretty low skill ceiling, and with the amount of speed sliding on this one, it definitely upped that there. Now, track number 2, we got a mini tech track here, only a couple drifts in this one, but it's always welcome to see an early tech track like this. I feel like in the past, during like the 23 seasons, they really got away from showcasing what you can really expect in the game, but the past year or so, I feel like these sorts of tracks have really made a great comeback into the campaigns, so give them credit for that, and this is another pretty good track here. For track number 3, we have a dirt track and another pretty solid track in general. I'd say the only thing I don't care for on this track is the no slides, and that has been kind of a common theme for me in the campaigns the past few seasons. It feels like since the alt cars were added, there have been a lot more no slides, or maybe I just haven't noticed them in the past beforehand. But yeah, there is something I just don't really care to perform all that much, especially on campaign tracks where I really don't care all that much about my time or rank. Track number 4 is this underwater type track. Really just not a fan of this one at all. It's certainly not a bad track. I just feel like it shouldn't exist in the campaign, or at best it should be a track number 1. But even as a track number 1, I think this would still be a rather weak submission. So yeah, I don't really feel like this is a great fit in the campaign. It's just a very boring track. So, not the worst thing in the world, but certainly it could do far better. Track number 5 is the bobsleigh track, and in all honesty, I like this track a fair amount, even though I'm not the biggest fan of bobsleigh in general. I think this one was decently well executed, especially for, an early White Series track. The thing on this one I was not a huge fan of, though, is the starts. You got to do the ice wiggles up the hill if you want a decent time and placement on this one, which for me is not all that much fun because it turns the track into a restart simulator, so a bit unfortunate there. Starting out the Green Series with track number 6, the mostly plastic track. I really wasn't the biggest fan of this one. The opening jump already sets you off with kind of bad vibes for the track, with the jump feeling just a little bit short, and then following that up, you got a plastic wall ride, which you get a bad gear in basically every single time. I'm not even sure it's possible to get a good gear up in that wall ride, and the rest of the track and the entirety of the track as a whole just really doesn't have any cohesion or flow in my opinion, and overall the entire thing just feels a bit off. Next up for track number 7, we have the full speed track, and on my discovery, I didn't really care for this one all that much. The wall rides in this one felt a little bit awkward, opening with a longer wall ride while you're slower, and then later on, a shorter wall ride while you're faster. So those were pretty awkward at the start, but the more I drove this one, the more I liked it. And unlike track number 6, I feel like this one is still fairly well calculated despite that, and obviously these were done on purpose. Unlike track number 6, where it felt like they had the things they wanted, and even if they didn't work, they just left them as they were. So overall, I did like this track. Track number 8 is, kind of a mix of the old and new of the track 8 styles. You can see the old architecture of the downhill bumpy style track, though this one is not all that bumpy. It is, however, very straight and a little bit boring in my opinion because of it. There are some tricks you can perform on this one, but overall it's not the most exciting track, but it's still perfectly fine. Track number 9 maybe is best described as a transitional tech track. I'm not really too sure on what a great style fit for this one is, but that's the best I can come up with. It's certainly a unique and interesting track. It's definitely not my favorite style of track though. I'm not a huge fan of tech in general, and this is kind of just a weird, side version of that. So not my favorite track in the world. It's certainly good, and I know a lot of people did like this one. And the final Green Series track gives us the typical car switching track number 10 like we've gotten for the past few seasons now. Not a terrible track, but I'm not the biggest fan of them by any means. They're all kind of the same exact deal for me. Now that, every single car is on this one, I find it to be a little bit less enjoyable because I like to use action keys for, all the different alt cars, so I'm pressing a ton of buttons, which is just generally really annoying. So yeah, this is not a bad track, but certainly not my favorite. Now, starting out the Blue Series here, track number 11, we have a dirt track on the castle blocks, and I really enjoyed this track, and that kind of goes for a lot of these castle block tracks that they've had, not only this one, but they've had a lot in the past few seasons as well. I really enjoy them. Maybe it's because they are a little bit more challenging to drive because you have the narrow lines throughout. Definitely requires a fair amount of precision to drive them cleanly, and certainly at this point in my playing, I guess you can call it career, I definitely want a bit more challenge in the tracks, and this one certainly gives you that. Next up, track number 12, we have the plastic track, and this is another pretty good track here, though the gearing on this one is a fair bit challenging, and I imagine that's what a lot of people are going to be struggling with on this one. You have the gear 4 uphill, which is not the most challenging part of the track, but still it can be a bit tricky to keep that gear 4. The hardest part, in my opinion, is keeping the gear 5 on this upcoming turn right here. You are pretty low in that gear 5, and it's a pretty harsh turn there to try to keep it on, but yeah, overall it is a pretty enjoyable track, but a little bit tricky. For track number 13, we have the grass track, and this is a good track, but there are some aspects of this one in which I feel could have made the track more enjoyable and also just a better track in general. And that really comes down to the later section of the track, which of course does have the bug slide that you can perform, which isn't the biggest deal, but the turn in general just feels very awkward. It doesn't really fit the flow of the rest of the track, and at the very end we also have a slow-mo, which slow-mos in general I'm not a huge fan of, especially when they're as pointless as this one was. Next up, we have our first alt car, at least solo alt car of the campaign on track number 14 with the desert car. This track is, fine for what it is. If you watch my last season's video on last season's campaign, you know that I'm not the biggest fan of the desert car. In fact, it became my least favorite of the alt cars due to the tipping of it and how easy it is to just instantaneously slide out and lose all your speed. So this track, it's fine for what it is, but I just don't really enjoy driving the desert car. And the final Blue Series track, track number 15, is a mixed track, starting out with this ice slide here, which is definitely not a thing I enjoyed all that much. Very important section right at the beginning of the track. I mean, I guess at least it's there, because if it was later in the track, that would be even worse. But yeah, it turns the track to a bit of a restart simulator. The rest of the track, the gearing on this one can be a bit brutal, whether it being gearing up or gearing down. That can happen in many locations on this one, but overall I was a pretty big fan of the track. I enjoyed driving it and gave this one a ++. And we'll be starting out the Red Series and track number 16 with yet another grass track. And these are types of tracks I typically really enjoy because grass is my favorite type of surface to drive in the game. And don't get me wrong, I still really did enjoy this track and do still think it is a good track. But like track number 13, I think there's just a little bit wrong with the flow of this track and the gearing on the track in general. Like this turn right here, we get gear 5 just to immediately drop down back to gear 4 on that turn. And then later on in the track where there is a reactor boost, there's a lot of gearing up to 5, back down to 4, then back up to 5 again. It just feels a little bit off and doesn't really feel like the smoothest thing in the world there. It is helped a little bit by the reactor boost, kind of smoothing it out a bit, but it still feels just a little bit off in my opinion. But overall, I do still think this was a pretty good track. And now we have our next alt car track here on track number 17 with the snow car. And I feel like these snow car tracks they have made have been much better than the other alt car tracks that they have made. Maybe it's just because I'm better at driving the snow car. I'm not quite sure, but I always have found them to drive much better than any of the other alt car tracks. This one I did definitely struggle with the hairpin turns, but I eventually got them down. Even with that crash there, I still got a decent time. I'd say the one thing I didn't care for on this track, and what I have seen others say they didn't really care for on this track, is the very final turn. For the amount of speed you have and how sharp the final turn is extremely easy to tip over. So you're driving the entire track and just banking everything on this final turn and not tipping over. So overall, a solid track, but the final turn could have been better. Now, track 18 is a mix of wet and dry wood, and in the past, I've said, you know, I'm kind of just sick of wood in general, especially wet wood. It seems like their main go-to style in the campaigns for the wood surface, but it really just feels like there's not a whole lot you can do with it, so it's hard to fault them, but I still am a little bit sick of the wet wood style. For this track in general, I think it's perfectly fine. However, the one part I didn't really care for on this one is that there is an early wet wood flick off the platform, and that seems to basically determine your entire run. If you get a good flick there, well, you know, you might have a pretty good run. If you get a bad one, you're completely screwed. Now, track number 19 gives us our NASCAR track that we usually get maybe 1 or 2 of per year in the official campaigns, and I will give credit where credit is due. For whatever reason, the Nadeo-style NASCAR tracks are always pretty good, in my opinion. Definitely prefer these over some of the NASCAR tracks, or even most of the NASCAR tracks that we rarely get in Track of the Days. So yeah, credit where credit is due for that. As far as this track goes, it's another solid one. I really don't have any complaints about it. NASCAR now is really not my preferred style to drive. In fact, it's pretty low on my preferred styles to drive. But again, you know, this one is not bad by any means, and I actually think it is a pretty darn good track. And that's pretty much all I have to say about it. Nothing too special about it, nothing too outstanding about it. Just an overall solid track. Now, ending out the Red Series with track number 20, the Royale style track, I guess you can call it. This is a rather unique and interesting style that I don't think they have done before in the past, so credit where credit's due on this one as well, because they pulled it off extremely well. I did enjoy driving this one a fair amount, and it's probably my favorite one out of the entire campaign. It definitely can be a little bit tough on some of these turns, especially this one here, where you really got to nail the entrance to that wall grind. And I'd say my only complaints about this one is just the length of the track. I wish it was about a, 5 to 10 seconds longer. Moving on to the Black Series and track number 21, we have the Tech track, which is kind of their go-to style for track number 21's. Definitely an overwhelming amount of Tech tracks in this spot compared to the other styles. As far as this track in general goes, I feel like it could have been much better. I felt like throughout this track, it just felt very awkward. Like a lot of the drifts were very strange. Starting out early on, it's very easy to get bad gearing for the first drift in the track, and then, somewhere towards the middle sections and even later in the track, a lot of the drifts just felt very off and very weirdly timed, and I just don't know what else to say about it other than that. It just a lot of awkwardness throughout in this one, and I just wasn't the biggest fan of it. Next up, track number 22. This is a mixed track with all the effect blocks, I believe. I did not look into it and see what they all use, but I'm pretty sure, if not all of them, at least a large majority of them are on this track. And I'll say for what they were going for, I think they did a decent job of a track here, but there were still parts of this one I didn't really care for, and that includes the slow-mo sections, like this opening one here. Really doesn't serve much purpose at all because you're already done with the drift by the time you hit these slow-mo block, so you're already slow enough for the next turn as well that it really doesn't even do anything for you. And the ones at the end, there's like 2 of them back to back on a straight line, which are just completely unnecessary. Adds length to the track, and the track is already pretty long, so yeah, again, pretty unnecessary ones at the end there. The other one I didn't really care for is the no braking section. I'm not really sure what they could have done better with that. I just feel like I'm just not that big of a fan of no braking in general. Maybe they could have used more of a purpose on sort of a NASCAR track, but on a regular track like this, I don't think they work great. But yeah, overall, for what they were going for, I think this was a decently well executed track. For track number 23, we have the final alt car track, this time with the rally car, which for the rally car for me is kind of very similar to the desert car with my disliking for it. Unlike the desert car, which can tip over and lose all speed instantaneously, the rally car kind of just slides all over the place and you slowly lose speed like that. I just find it a little bit annoying to drive as well. For the most part, this track, I didn't mind it all too much. Really where it started to fall apart for me and where I started to really kind of dislike it was the second hairpin turn that will be coming up here very shortly. I think that turn just felt really bad in the grand scheme of the rest of the track, just felt really off. So yeah, for the most part, the track was kind of fine up until that point, and again, the rally car is certainly not my favorite to drive. Next up, track 24 is a full ice track, in the first full ice track since spring 24, I believe. There was like track 18, which was rally ice, and like I think track 14 was a full ice track, but I do not believe we had one last season, and if we did, it must not have been all that great because I do not remember it. But yeah, this one is certainly a unique style that they went for, which is kind of a common theme for this campaign, doing new stuff. This one is sort of a multi-lap, but not exactly. We're driving the track forwards and then back in reverse, so very interesting there. For the most part, I do think this track works well. There are some sections that are really easy to gear out on, in my opinion, which is not all that bad, but still can cause some troubles. I did not like the way the multi-lap starts, though. I think that turn out of it was not all that great. And that'll leave us with the final track of the campaign, track number 25, a rather long track as well, a minute and 30 seconds plus on this AT, much longer than I really care to drive. I have no patience for tracks this long, so I got this author medal and got the heck out of this one. As far as the quality of the route on this track goes, I honestly wasn't the biggest fan of like the entire first 30 seconds of this track. Like the opening grass turn is very finicky on the keeping of gear 4, but then you just immediately lose that gear 4 anyway on the jump up and a plastic wall bounce. And even sometimes I even drop down to gear 2 with that bounce, which is super annoying because it basically just kills your run. And even with a normal gear down to 3 there, the drift immediately after kind of sucks too, because sometimes you are gearing up right when you're about to initiate that drift, resulting in an extremely poor drift. And you also can very easily no-slide that part as well. So yeah, just not the biggest fan of the first 30 seconds of this track. The rest of it, though, I was perfectly fine with. It works pretty darn well, but again, the first little bit of this track really takes away from the rest of it. And I'd say the only other thing of note for this track is they said this was the biggest project in the campaign history, and that left everyone with pretty high expectations, and ultimately left everyone, including myself, a bit disappointed in what we actually got. Now, just going over this season altogether, I think it was a pretty darn good one, and obviously with me reworking my rankings, I don't have a real comparison to past seasons, but I can definitely say with 100% certainty that this season will rank at least in the top half of all of them, and will probably also most likely rank in the top 5. I'd say other things of note for this season, I do like some of the experimentations with some of the tracks, like track number 20 being sort of a Royale style, and the multi-lap ice track was also an interesting concept, both of which I definitely would not mind seeing in future seasons. It's also really hard for me to come up with any huge negatives about this season. Obviously, there's some aspects of some tracks that I don't really care for, and the only tracks I really didn't like all that much were track 6 and 4, and they weren't really all that bad, so that's a pretty good spot to be in. So again, this overall was a very good season. But that'll be it for today's video and for the Fall 24 season. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and subscribe. And I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you all here in a couple of months with Winter 25.